Chapter 12. Beth saw their boss, D.S. Scrivener, glance pointedly at the clock on the wall as she and Matt returned to their office in Coleshaw Police Station. "Seeing Mrs. Slater took longer than expected, sir," Beth said, pausing by his desk. "We had to interview her neighbour, Mrs. Jennings, the one who lost the baby," Matt added. "Why?" D.S. Scrivener asked. "Because Mrs. Slater's new evidence is that the baby was alive when it was taken from the house," Beth explained. "She's claiming she heard it cry. If she's right, then its death should have been registered by now, but it hasn't been. We spoke to the mother, Emma Jennings, but she isn't sure what happened. She was too distressed at the time. I'm going to phone the midwife who was involved and clarify the position." "Okay," D.S. Scrivener said. "Then I want the two of you to return to Mr. Bates and arrest him. We have the evidence we need now." "Yes, sir," Matt said. He and Beth went to their desks. They sat opposite each other, their computer screens back to back. "I'd better check the registry records first," Beth said, logging onto her computer. "Just in case Mrs. Slater's friend Nora has got it wrong and the death has now been registered." "Good idea," Matt said, then turned his attention to his screen and the case he was working on. Beth began by checking the register of births, then deaths, and finally stillbirths. 15 minutes later, she had the confirmation she needed. Nora was right. There was still no record of David Jennings ever having been born or dying. Beth then spent a few moments finding the contact details for the midwife, Anne Long. Her name appeared as a member of staff at Coleshaw Health Centre. Beth keyed in the number for the centre. "Coleshaw Health Centre," a trim voice announced. "Good afternoon. I'm Detective Constable Beth Mays, Coleshaw CID. I'd like to speak to one of your midwives, please. Anne Long. I'll put you through to midwifery." "Thank you." Beth waited. Then a female voice sang, "Midwifery? How can I help you?" "Good afternoon. It's Detective Constable Beth Mays, Coleshaw CID. I'd like to speak to one of your midwives, Anne Long. She's out at present on a call. I could ask her to phone you on her return." "Does she have a work mobile?" Beth asked. "Yes, but she won't be able to answer it if she's with a patient." "No, I appreciate that. If she doesn't answer, I'll leave a message." "No problem. Just a moment, please." A few seconds later, she came back on the line and read out the number for Anne Long, as Beth made a note. "Has Anne worked there for many years?" Beth asked. "Oh, yes. She's one of our longest-serving midwives. She's very highly thought of. Many mums request her." "I'm sure she's excellent," Beth said. "My inquiry has nothing to do with her competence. I'm doing a routine follow-up after a baby's death. David Jennings. It was a home delivery." "Oh, yes, that was so sad. Anne was very upset, as we all were. But Anne is the best person to support the parents." "Does Anne carry out many home deliveries?" Beth asked. "Yes, that's her speciality. She loves home births." "Thank you for your help. I'll give Anne a call now." "You know that sometimes, despite the best care in the world, a baby can't survive. It's heartbreaking for all involved, but it's no one's fault." "No, I understand that," Beth said. "Thanks again for your help." Beth took a sip from the bottle of water on her desk and then keyed in Anne Long's mobile number. Matt was concentrating on his screen as he typed. Anne's phone was answered after a couple of rings. "Hello, Anne Long speaking." "Good afternoon. It's Detective Constable Beth Mays, Coleshaw CID. Is this a convenient time to talk?" "I have a few minutes, yes. Why? What's it about?" I understand you were the midwife for Emma and Ian Jennings. Yes, that's correct. Emma's just called me. She was very upset by your visit. It wasn't my intention to upset her, Beth said, meeting Matt's gaze as he glanced up from his computer screen. I'm hoping you can answer my questions. I'll try. I understand Emma had a home delivery? Yes. And their baby didn't survive? That's correct. Was the baby full-term? Beth asked. Nowhere near. So it was stillborn? No. A late miscarriage. Oh, I see. How many weeks gestation was it, if that's the right term? It is, but I'm sorry, this is very personal information. I should like to know the reason you're asking before I share it. Of course, I'm following up on a call from a member of the public who thought their baby had been born alive and is now missing. They are wrong. It was 23 weeks, more a fetus than a baby. At that stage, it's known as a late miscarriage, not a stillborn. Stillborn is after 24 weeks. Do late miscarriages have to be registered? Beth asked. Not at present, although there is some feeling there should be a register for late miscarriages, as it could help give the parents closure. So, it wasn't alive when you took it from the house? Beth asked as she wrote. Matt was still watching her, listening to the one-sided conversation. No. Some fetuses can survive at that stage, but not many. Mr. and Mrs. Jennings' baby couldn't, even if it had been born in hospital. It wasn't properly formed. It's all in my report. I see. So it couldn't have cried? No. It might have made a sound, but not a proper cry like a full-term viable baby does. No one would have attempted to resuscitate it, not even in hospital. I understand. I believe you disposed of the body? Yes, at the parents' request. It was cremated at the hospital. Is that everything now? Anne asked. Only I'm on my way to see a mum who's in active labour? Yes, thank you. And you won't have to visit Mr. and Mrs. Jennings again? I believe it's the second time you've been, and they're very upset. They have enough to cope with at present. There won't be any need for me to see them again, Beth confirmed, and winding up the conversation, she said goodbye. It was a late miscarriage, Beth told Matt, which explains why it's not on any of the registers. You don't have to register until 24 weeks. It was a fetus, and not fully formed. That also explains why the parents didn't want to see or hold it, Matt said, grimacing. I wouldn't have wanted to, would you? Probably not. I'll just complete and file my report, and then we can go and arrest Mr. Bates. Chapter 13. On Tuesday evening, after Jan had finished her dinner, she settled on the sofa with her laptop and a mug of tea. She was feeling positive and determined to write the first page of her novel. A difficult romance. At least she had a title now. No excuses. The nighttime visits had stopped, and Tinder was peacefully asleep at the other end of the sofa, eyes closed and ears relaxed. Jan had spent most of Sunday afternoon in the garden, boarding up the hole in the hedge, using what she'd found in Camille's shed, pieces of wood, wire netting, and a roll of twine. Doubtless it was a makeshift job by Chris's standards, but it had held when she'd tested it. She had wedged strips of wood across the hole, then covered it with wire netting, securing it with twine to the hedge. It had worked. Whatever had been getting in wasn't any longer. She and Tinder had enjoyed an uninterrupted and peaceful Sunday and Monday evening. her confidence received another small boost. That morning, she'd switched off the motion sensor light at the socket in the spare bedroom. It wasn't needed any longer, and as Camille had said in her text, the light gobbled electricity. It wasn't just when the floodlight came on. The sensor used electricity too, so it was a steady drain on the power. She texted Chris to say she'd successfully blocked up the hole and all was well. He had replied with a thumbs-up emoji. She'd also texted Camille. "I've used some of the wood and netting from the shed to block up a hole in the hedge at the bottom of the garden. Hope that's okay." She had replied straight away. "Yes, fine with me. Sorry you've had a problem with something getting into the garden." Which Jan thought was slightly odd because she hadn't told Camille something was coming into the garden. She supposed Chris had. She took another sip of her tea and set the mug down within reach. Her fingers were poised expectantly over the keyboard, ready to begin. She stared at the page before her, blank except for the title and Chapter 1. It was so hard getting started, and she knew a good opening was crucial. Those considering buying a book based their decision on the blurb on the back and the first page. Online advice for new writers stated, "Don't worry about writing the perfect first page. Just get down what's in your head. You will revise and edit it once the book is complete. Just start." Easier said than done, Jan thought. She forced her fingers to start typing with the thought in her head. It was a cold winter's night, and a frost was already beginning to settle on the lawn. She stopped and read what she'd written. It seemed okay, so she continued. At 11 p.m, Melissa was the only one in the house still awake. She stopped again. She thought she heard a noise outside. She listened, but it wasn't repeated. Tinder was still fast asleep, so it was nothing to worry about. There were plenty of noises in and around the cottage, especially at night, that Tinder was used to and she was not. He was her barometer. Jan looked at what she'd written and then deleted it. It would be better if it was set in summer, as it was a romance. She began again. It was a hot summer's night. At 2 a.m, the temperature had hardly dropped. Melissa lay naked below a single sheet, her bedroom window wide open. Yes, that sounded much better. She was pleased. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard as she waited for the inspiration to continue. Then she heard it again. A noise on the other side of the patio window. She looked at the closed curtains and went cold. Tinder was awake now too, on guard, hackles up, staring at the curtains and growling. "What is it?" she asked quietly, her voice unsteady. Was it back again after 2 nights? Had it got into the garden? Or was there something else out there? It could be anything, she told herself. A hedgehog, rats, mice. The sensor light was switched off. If she went upstairs and turned it on, whatever was outside would very likely be gone by the time she returned to the living room. Setting aside her laptop, Jan slowly knelt on the sofa so she was facing the curtain. Tinder, still growling, was watching her. She carefully took hold of the edge of the curtain and then quickly pulled it open. A pair of eyes looked back. She screamed and dropped the curtain. Tinder threw himself at the window as if to attack, but it had gone. He ran to the back door, barking frantically to be let out. But unlike other evenings, Jan wouldn't be letting him out to give chase. It wasn't safe. Her hand shook as she grabbed her phone to call Chris. "Thank goodness you're there," she gasped as soon as he answered. "There was someone in the back garden. They came right up to the window and looked in." "Are you sure?" Chris asked. "Yes. Can you hear Tinder barking? He wants to give chase." I'll come straight over. Lock the doors and don't let Tinder out.
Shall I call the police?
Jan asked. No, wait until I get there and we'll decide then. I'm on my way. Trembling, Jan went to the back door and checked it was locked. Then, taking her phone with her, she went down the hall to wait by the front door. It seemed safer to be at the front of the cottage and away from the back garden and the living room window. Tinder, finding himself alone, stopped barking and ran to her side. What had she seen? She didn't know. She'd only seen a pair of eyes and a shadow before it fled. Too small for an adult. A child? Surely not. Yet the eyes had shown human expression, intrigue. If only the sensor light had been on. With her heart still racing and trying to make sense of what she'd seen, Jan leant against the front door for support and waited, willing Chris to hurry. Although Tinder had stopped barking, he remained agitated. Every so often he gave a low growl while looking down the hall towards the back of the cottage. Had he heard it return? Or perhaps it hadn't left the garden at all. Jan shuddered. Was there just the one, or were there others? She'd only seen one pair of eyes. A few minutes later, she heard a car come down the lane and pull up. Thank goodness. But she waited until the bell rang.
Is that you, Chris?
Yes. She opened the front door and nearly fell into Chris's arms.
I was so scared, she said. Thank you for coming.
It's okay, come on. Let's sit you down. He took her arm and steered her into the living room where he eased her onto the sofa. Shall I get you a drink?
No, I'm all right. I had a fright. Whatever it was came right up to the window and looked in. Thanks for coming so quickly.
I'll get the torch and check outside, Chris said.
Do you think it's safe?
He threw her a reassuring smile, suggesting there was really nothing to be afraid of and that she might have been overreacting, then fetched the torch from the hall, Tinder at his heels. Keep him in. I don't want him disappearing, Chris said, as he returned to the living room with the torch. He picked up Tinder and placed him on Jan's lap, then went into the kitchen and unlocked the back door.
Be careful,
she called. Don't worry. Again, his tone suggested there was really nothing to be afraid of. Jan held Tinder close. It was comforting, as Chris went out the back door, closing it again after him. Tinder tried to break free and follow Chris, but Jan kept him securely on her lap, stroking his fur to calm him. She supposed she could have gone with Chris, but even with him beside her, there was no way she was going into the garden now, and she wondered if he should have. How could he be certain that whoever was out there had gone and wouldn't harm him? A few minutes later, the back door opened and Chris returned. It's all clear, he said. She let go of Tinder and he ran into the kitchen. Good boy, he said, patting him. It's okay, there's nothing out there now. Taking off his muddy shoes, he came into the living room. Whatever you saw has long gone, but they've made short work of your repair. The wood is strewn all over the lawn. I'll come over at the weekend and fix it. They? Jan asked. I'm guessing there was more than one. Foxes can live in groups, although they usually hunt alone. You think it was a fox? Most likely. They've been trying to get into my chicken coop again. It didn't look like a fox to me, she said. And the wood was in place this afternoon. It must have happened after dark while I was in here. She shuddered at the thought. I think there was someone in the garden and we should call the police. She picked up her phone. So you can give a good description of them? Chris asked, sitting in his armchair. Jan paused and thought about what she'd seen. I can't. It was too dark. I switched the sensor light off to save electricity. I only saw their eyes at the window, but the outline looks similar to the last time I saw them. Chris looked at her. You've seen someone in the garden before? You didn't say. It was the night you returned Tinder, and I'm not saying it was definitely a person. I didn't tell you at the time because I couldn't make sense of what I'd seen.
I still can't, even less so after this evening, but what? Chris asked seriously, holding her gaze. It seemed ridiculous now. Whatever I saw the last time was very agile and went over the side gate. I thought it could have been a child, but now I'm not sure. I'm sorry, this sounds crazy. I don't know what I saw, she finished lamely. Thankfully, Chris wasn't laughing and appeared to be taking her concern seriously. You've obviously had a shock, seen something, and been very scared by it. But it was dark on both occasions, and our eyes can play tricks on us in the dark. He glanced at her open laptop. I know you want peace and quiet to write your book, but do you think you've been overdoing it? It's very isolated here, and you've been spending a lot of time by yourself. Just you and your imagination. He had phrased it so delicately, Jan found she couldn't take offence. It wasn't her imagination, but she didn't feel like arguing the point now. His face lightened and lost its seriousness as he said, Perhaps I could help ease your isolation by taking you out for dinner one evening? Oh, I see. I don't know, Jan said, surprised. It's very kind of you to ask. Well, he was waiting for her reply. Won't I be treading on someone's toes? She asked. I sort of assumed that you and Camille. But Chris was already shaking his head. It's true, we had a relationship some years ago, but for various reasons it didn't work out. We've remained good friends. That's all we are now, friends. So no, you won't be stepping on Camille's toes if you come out to dinner with me. Jan smiled. Then yes, please, I'd like to. Good. Tomorrow. She nodded. I'll collect you at 7 o'clock. That'll give me a chance to shower and change after work. Perfect. And as for whatever is getting into the garden, I'll fix the hole in the hedge at the weekend. I'll also go into the woods and see what's happening on the other side. Then I can reassure you. Thank you. Chapter 14. Jan let Tinder sleep on her bed that night. She felt safer with him beside her. Even so, it was a long time before she fell asleep. Every noise seemed to suggest that whatever was out there could have come back. Tinder was restless too, and kept rising from his sleep to pace the bed, ears up and alert, as though he might have heard something. It didn't help Jan's nerves at all. Eventually, she must have fallen asleep in the early hours. The last time she looked at the clock on her phone, it had been 2:15 a.m., and now it was 8:05 and daylight. She breathed a sigh of relief. Getting out of bed, she threw on her dressing gown, pushed her feet into her slippers, and opened the bedroom curtains. Tinder, tail wagging, was at her side, ready for breakfast and his morning run. Come on then, good boy, Jan said and went downstairs. Life here seemed so much better in the daytime, and she was seeing Chris this evening for dinner. She was looking forward to it, more than she cared to admit. She had liked him from their first meeting, and would like him more now she knew he wasn't in a relationship with Camille. Good friends, he'd said. Did that mean friends with benefits? Then she caught herself. Chris had asked her out for dinner to help alleviate her isolation, he'd said, and that was all. His friendship with Camille was nothing to do with her, and anyway, she wasn't ready for another proper relationship yet, with Chris or anyone. Downstairs, Jan opened the curtains in the living room. How different the garden seemed by daylight, clearly visible, peaceful and non-threatening. She went into the kitchen, fed Tinder, and then filled the coffee machine and dropped 2 slices of bread into the toaster. As usual, Tinder ate half his breakfast and then trotted to the back door to be let out for a run. As Jan opened the door, she saw the pieces of wood she'd used to block up the hole in the hedge
strewn across the lawn as Chris had said. It was nice of him to offer to repair the damage at the weekend, but she couldn't wait until then. Not 3 or 4 nights with a gaping hole, an open invitation to whatever it was to return. She'd have another attempt at repairing it, make it stronger. It had lasted 2 nights before, so if she made it more robust, hopefully it would stay in place. Tinder finished in the garden by sniffing around the wood, and then returned indoors to eat the rest of his breakfast. Jan buttered her toast, poured some coffee and took her breakfast upstairs to have as she showered and dressed. Bring warm clothes suitable for the country, Camille had included in her email instructions. She had, and was now dressed in jeans and a thick woolen jumper. Returning downstairs, Jan took her padded zip-up jacket from its hook in the hallway and went into the kitchen. Tinder looked at her, hopeful for a walk. "I'll take you into the village later, but for now we're going in the garden," she told him. She knew she could trust him not to disappear through the hedge in daylight. It was after dark when he gave chase and vanished into the woods. Tucking her phone into her jacket pocket, Jan went into the garden and began gathering up the pieces of wood and stacking them to one side. They hadn't been broken or damaged, just removed from where she'd fixed them over the hole. She found the wire netting with the twine she'd used to tie it in place, still attached. As she looked more closely, she could see that it hadn't been gnawed through. The knots had been unpicked. Could foxes do that? No. What animal could? None that she knew of. She crossed the lawn to the hole in the hedge and, squatting down, examined the track marks. There were fresh ones, but it was still impossible to identify them. On the branches either side of the hole was more twine. Puzzled and unnerved, but wanting to cover the hole again as quickly as possible, Jan began bringing over the wood she'd used previously and started boarding up the hole again. Tinder sniffed around the patio. She fetched more wood and wire netting from the shed and secured it in place with twine. It was much better fortified now, stronger and more robust. But as she worked, she had a strange, unsettling feeling that all her efforts could be in vain. Anything that had the intelligence to untie knots and disassemble wood and wire netting wouldn't be kept out by this. The more she thought about it, the more she was convinced an animal hadn't done this. It must have been a person or people, and she trembled at the thought. Chris had been wrong to dissuade her from reporting it to the police, simply because she couldn't give a good description. Half an hour later, satisfied she had done her best and the repair would hopefully keep them out for a while at least, Jan returned the tools to the shed and went indoors. She sat on a kitchen stool and phoned Coleshaw police station. "I want to report an intruder," she said to the call handler. "Is the intruder on the premises now?" "No. I'll put you through to an officer as soon as one is available." Jan then had to wait a few minutes before an officer came on the line. He introduced himself as Detective Constable Matt Davis and asked for her full name and contact details. Jan then explained that she was renting Ivy Cottage, Wood Lane, and that someone, or possibly more than one person, had been coming into the garden after dark. She said she thought they were getting in through a hole in the hedge at the rear of the property, which backed onto Coleshaw Woods. He asked for the dates and times of the incidents, and then said, "Did you get a good look at the intruder?" "No, it was too dark. Just a shadow, really. But there are prints in the earth where they're coming through." "Okay, I'll take a look. Will you be in at around 3 o'clock this afternoon?" "Yes, I can be. I've got to visit someone in Merryless first, so I'll stop by after, although hopefully now you've secured the gap, it won't happen again."
"Thank you," Jan said, pleased he was taking her concerns seriously. "Have you had any other reports of this happening? I've only been in the cottage a few weeks, but judging from the footprints, it could have been going on for some time."
"Not as far as I'm aware," Matt Davis replied. "In the summer, we sometimes have problems with teenagers messing around in the woods and making campfires, but that's usually at the other end, up near the quarry. I believe Ivy Cottage backs onto the thickest part of the forest." "Yes, although I haven't been in that part of the woods."
"Oh, you should," he said enthusiastically. "They're at their best in autumn. The colours are amazing. Keep to the footpaths, and you can't get lost."
"I might give it a try," Jan replied. The local police seem far friendlier than those in the towns and cities. Matt confirmed he would be with her soon after 3, and winding up the conversation said goodbye. Jan was pleased she'd phoned. Justified and exonerated, her spirits lifted. She'd done the right thing in reporting it, and although she hadn't been able to provide a description, it was being investigated. Now she needed to go to the village store to make sure she was back in plenty of time for his visit. "Tinder, come on, walkies," she called. She checked the back door was locked, then went into the hall and unhooked the dog lead from its peg. Although Tinder could run freely along the lane, she would need to use it when they neared the village and had to cross the main road. "Tinder, walkies," she called again. He didn't usually need telling twice. "Tinder!" He appeared at the top of the stairs, tail wagging and with a mischievous look on his face. As he came down, Jan saw he had something white in his mouth. "What have you got?" she asked, and took it away. It was a small white booty belonging to a baby or a large doll, now covered in saliva. "Where did you get that?" Tinder looked back guiltily. Jan went upstairs and found the door to the second bedroom wide open. She couldn't have closed it properly after she'd switched off the sensor light. The contents of a number of Camille's carefully packed boxes were scattered across the floor. "Tinder, you naughty boy," she called. She'd have to clear it up later. She needed to go to the village store now, before DC Matt Davis arrived. "Naughty boy," she said again as she came downstairs. Tinder looked at her with large, sorrowful eyes. "It's okay," she said, rubbing his head. "It's not your fault. I shouldn't have allowed you upstairs. Your mistress doesn't." She ruffled his fur again, and then, lead in hand, opened the front door and set off for Merryless. As well as milk, she needed to top up on loose change to feed the meter. Also, she'd have a look at the food in the freezer. They kept a reasonable selection for a village store, to try to persuade villagers to shop there rather than going to the supermarkets in Coleshaw. Jan walked briskly along Wood Lane, with Tinder not far behind. The day had started off bright, but now the clouds were gathering. She could feel the temperature dropping. It was early November, and the weather forecast was predicting ground frost by the end of the week. Her mother was already asking about Christmas and hoping that Jan would spend it with them. But she couldn't leave Tinder alone. Her good friend Ruby had texted asking if she had any plans for Christmas and suggested they could spend it holed up in the cottage with wine and movies, which she liked the idea of. "Come on, Tinder, keep up," Jan called. He kept stopping to sniff and forage in the undergrowth at the edge of the woods. "Come on, good boy," Jan called again and turned. Tinder was nowhere to be seen. "Tinder!" she shouted. "Here now!" There was no sign of him. She stayed where she was and listened for any sound suggesting he could be close.
but the woods were eerily quiet. "Tinder, come on! Here, boy!" Still nothing. Worried and annoyed that she was having to retrace her steps, Jan went back along the lane. He'd been following her the last time she'd looked, not half a minute ago, but now he'd completely disappeared. She kept going, calling his name and looking into the woods on both sides. He must have chased something. But in which direction? There were trees to her left and right on both sides. "Tinder!" she shouted at the top of her voice. Then she heard a rustle. She spun round and looked into the woods where the noise had come from, just in time to see Tinder reappear, running flat out towards her. But what was that behind him? A flash of someone also running. The briefest glimpse before they disappeared into the woods. An image, an outline, the size and shape of a child, similar to the one she'd thought she'd seen scramble over the side gate of the cottage. Was it possible there could be a child or children living feral in the woods? Surely not. And yet. Chapter 15. Shaken, Jan ran along Wood Lane, her thoughts spinning. She kept her eyes straight ahead and didn't look into the woods either side, and certainly not behind her, for fear of what she might see. Tinder was running flat out beside her, his little legs working hard to keep up. It could have been a child, and yet something in its shape and the way it had moved between the trees suggested otherwise. Could it have been an adult trying to keep low to avoid being seen? She thought it was possible, which made her more afraid. Were they following her? If so, why? What did they want with her? Thank goodness she had reported it to the police, and an officer was coming this afternoon. It gave her some reassurance. Perspiring and out of breath, Jan finally stopped running when the lane met the main road. She put Tinder on his lead and then continued at a brisk walk towards Merryless. Tinder was also out of breath and panting heavily, his tongue drooling. He seemed as unnerved by what had happened in the woods as she was. Further up, she crossed the road and continued along the pavement to the village shop. Her pulse rate and breathing began to settle. Her biggest worry now was that she had to return along Wood Lane. The clouds were still gathering, thick grey clouds causing the sky to darken and the light to go early. If only she'd brought the car. Entering the store, Jan took a wire basket from the stack, quickly gathered together the items she needed and approached the counter. There were 2 customers ahead of her, and she waited impatiently. Once they'd been served, Lillian, the store owner, greeted her with a big smile. "Hello, love." Her first question, as always, was, "Is Chris looking after you all right?" Her husband Jim was Chris's brother. "He is," Jan replied. "Excellent." As Lillian scanned the items into the till, she made small talk. Jan replied, although her thoughts were still far away, in the lane and surrounding woods. She paid using a card and then asked for change for the meter. Lillian disappeared through a door behind her, into the office where the safe was. She returned with a bag of £1 coins, which Jan swapped for a £20 note. It was an arrangement Camille had begun some time before and worked well. "Are you managing to keep warm in the cottage?" Lillian asked as Jan tucked the bag of coins into her jacket pocket. "Yes, although it's not cheap, and winter has only just begun." "No, indeed," Lillian agreed. "Camille keeps meaning to have that old meter replaced, but never gets round to it." "I'm fine,"
Jan said. "As long as I remember to feed the meter." "And Tinder? Is he behaving himself?" Lillian asked, looking at him over the counter. "Not disappearing into the woods again?" "He does, given the opportunity," Jan said. She hesitated, then asked, "Do you know if there's anyone living in the woods?" "Apart from you mean?" "Yes, I mean actually living in the woods." "No, not as far as I know. What makes you ask?" She frowned, puzzled. "Coming here today, I thought I saw someone." "A hiker?" Lillian suggested. "Possibly," Jan shrugged. "Never mind. I just wondered. Thanks for the meter money." "You're welcome. Have a good evening." "Chris is taking you somewhere nice," she winked. "News travels fast," Jan said, returning her smile. "He was in here earlier and mentioned it." Another customer approached the till, so, thanking Lillian for the meter money again, Jan said goodbye and left. Outside, Jan kept Tinder on a short lead as they crossed the main road, and then eased it off a bit as they walked to the end of Wood Lane. What she'd seen wasn't someone hiking in the woods. Yet Lillian hadn't heard of anyone living in them, and she was usually aware of what went on around here. Jan paused at the end of Wood Lane and looked along it as far as she could before it disappeared around a bend. With woods on both sides and the sky grey, the lane appeared like a long, dark tunnel. As usual, it was deserted. It seemed a long way to the cottage, but she needed to get going. Keeping Tinder on the lead, Jan set off at a jog, but it was difficult with a bag full of shopping banging against her leg. Tinder was tired. His little legs were having to work hard to keep up, and he kept wanting to stop. Eventually, Jan slowed to a brisk walk, which Tinder could manage. As they turned the last bend in the lane, the cottage came into view. Jan stopped dead. There was someone in the front garden. Someone small. Too far away to identify with the light so poor. A shadow. But now moving towards her front door. Tinder saw it too, and began barking, straining against the lead to be let free. They turned and ran, disappearing into the woods at the side of the cottage. "Hey, stop! Come back!" Jan cried, and ran the rest of the way to the cottage. "Hello? Is someone there?" she called into the shrubbery, feeling braver now she was home again. Tinder had stopped barking and was sniffing the air. No noise came from the other side. "Hello? Anyone there?" She tried again and listened. The only sound was the chirp of a distant bird. Tinder had lost interest, suggesting that whoever or whatever it was had gone. But what were they doing at her front door? Trying to get in? She called out one more time, and then went indoors where she let Tinder off his lead. He ran around the downstairs barking, and then went to his water bowl where he drank thirstily. Preoccupied and disturbed by this last encounter, Jan quickly unpacked the freezer food and left the rest to do later. Taking off her jacket, she picked up her laptop. There was something she wanted to check. Previously, when she'd looked online for information about the creatures that lived in the woods, she'd searched for animals living in Coleshaw Woods. Now she typed in "strange sightings in Coleshaw Woods." Up came pages of websites and news articles. The top one carried the headline, "Strange Encounter in Coleshaw Woods." But as she read, it soon became clear it was an interview with a man who claimed to have seen an unidentified flying object hovering over the woods. What she'd seen certainly wasn't a UFO, although it could be alien, she thought with a shudder. Jan scrolled down the pages. There were reports about a body being found in the quarry in Coleshaw Woods 2 years ago.
The police had struggled to identify the woman, as she was a stranger to the area. But the crime had been solved. She found another article about a woman, Miss Susan Pritchard, 65, who'd been walking her dog in the woods when it had chased something and disappeared. While she was trying to find it, she thought she'd heard a baby cry and had reported it to the police. But after an extensive search, nothing had been found, and it was decided it was very likely a cat she'd heard. It was a strange cry for a cat, she was quoted as saying. Interesting, Jan thought, but she hadn't heard a noise like a cat. She continued down the list of articles, pausing to read anything that might be relevant and explain what she'd seen. Half an hour later, she was forced to admit that nothing remotely matching what she had seen had been sighted in the woods. Unsure if she should feel relieved or disappointed, Jan closed the laptop, finished unpacking the groceries, fed the meter, and left the bag of change beside it in the cupboard under the stairs. She made herself a coffee and took it upstairs. She needed to get a move on. DC Matt Davis would be here soon, and she was seeing Chris later. But first she needed to clear up the mess Tinder had made in the spare bedroom. She went in. He'd really made the most of his time in the bedroom. Many of Camille's boxes had at least some of their contents removed. Thankfully, he hadn't chewed much. The booty he'd brought to her earlier was a bit mangled, and Jan now saw that some of the polythene bags on the bed containing Camille's clothes had teeth marks. Just as well he hadn't managed to tear them open and chew what was inside. Setting her mug of coffee to one side, Jan knelt on the floor and began repacking, hopefully returning the items to their correct box. Tinder was exhausted after his long walk and was asleep downstairs, so couldn't do any more damage. Jan would tell Camille what had happened, apologize and reassure her it wouldn't happen again, as she was making sure the door to the spare bedroom was kept shut at all times. In one box she found another white bootie that matched the one Tinder had brought to her. It was still partially wrapped in tissue paper, together with a small white outfit belonging to a baby or doll. Jan had no idea why Camille would have these, and it was none of her business. She carefully rewrapped the booties and the outfit in the tissue paper, and was about to return the parcel to the box when she saw a photograph album further down. She knew straight away she shouldn't open it. It was personal and wrong of her to pry. But curiosity quickly got the better of her, and one little peep wouldn't hurt. Camille never need know. Jan carefully lifted out the glossy light grey, professionally bound album. It was commemorative, the type that could be created online by uploading digital photographs of a wedding party, holiday or similar event. On the front was a picture of a golden sun setting over a deep blue sea, and beneath it was the title, Our Last Holiday, with a date 3 years before. Even more curious, Jan opened the first page and immediately saw whose holiday it had been. Camille and Chris looked back at her from a Caribbean island. How perfectly matched they were, with similar hair colouring, high cheekbones and open smiles. They made the ideal couple. Jan felt a pang of envy and wondered why they'd broken up. She turned the pages. Photographs of Camille in her bikini on a sun lounger by the pool, Chris coming out of the sea dripping wet from a swim and laughing. He had a strong, muscular body. The two of them eating at a restaurant, climbing a mountain, sightseeing, either taken by someone they'd asked or with a selfie stick. As Jan continued to turn the pages, it became increasingly obvious that they'd had a wonderful time and had been very much in love.
So why had it been their last holiday? What had gone so badly wrong to end their relationship? Chris had admitted he'd had a relationship with Camille, but had been vague. Jan had formed the impression it had been a casual relationship, but these photographs said otherwise. She felt deflated. Camille was an attractive, confident woman who had a successful career. Chris had clearly doted on her. True, he was taking her out tonight, but she couldn't be anything but second best. He had seen her as a lonely singleton who, having spent too much time alone, was imagining things. In short, he felt sorry for her, nothing more. He was probably now regretting ever asking her out. Jan closed the album, returned it to the box, then placed the parcel containing the booties and outfit on top. She folded the lid and left the box where she'd found it. The shine had gone out of the evening ahead. She drained the last of her coffee, and then, picking up her phone, texted Chris. "Will understand if you want to cancel." But his reply was instant. "Wouldn't hear of it. Looking forward to it. Pick you up at 7. See you later. Chris. Kiss." Chapter 16. "Why didn't you tell me before?" Ian asked, upset and angry. "I don't understand. I didn't think we had any secrets. And then this." He spread his hands open in dismay. "We don't have secrets," Emma said. "Only this one. I'm sorry. I was going to tell you, but then there was so much going on with the police coming back. It didn't seem like a good time." "And now is a good time?" he asked crossly. "I come home from work early to take you out, only to be told you're not the person I married. Am I supposed to accept it just like that?" "I am the same person you married," Emma cried, hurt. "It's still me." "But you don't have your father's genes. I wasted all that time researching your family tree, and he's not even family." "He is my family. He's my father, and I love him." Emma's eyes filled. "But you don't have his DNA," Ian said, equally frustrated. "You have the DNA of someone else, a donor, a stranger. You must see that." "Yes, I know. But Mum said the donor couldn't possibly be responsible for the defective gene because all donors are thoroughly screened." "How can she be certain?" "They went to a proper clinic and all donors had their DNA checked to make sure they didn't pass on anything." "What clinic?" Ian asked. "Where is it?" "I don't know," Emma said helplessly. "I didn't ask. It doesn't matter to me. It never has." "It matters to me and my research," Ian snapped. "Too much," Emma retaliated. "I know why you're so angry. It's because this has shown I can't have the defective gene. You haven't found anything on my mother's side. You told me that, and now this rules out my father too. So it has to be you. I think you've become obsessed with this, Ian. Look at all these death certificates." She grabbed a handful and threw them at him. "It's taken over, Ian. It's ridiculous. Let it go. It's destroying us." There was silence as they both glared at each other. Then Ian said more gently, "What happened to us was unimaginably horrible, and I have to find out what caused it, whether I am to blame or not. We know we're not the only couple around here to have a pregnancy go wrong. Everyone says it's the discharge from the power station contaminating the water that causes the birth defects. That's what you should be researching, not us." "I will, once I've ruled out our DNA," Ian agreed. "I'm sorry for shouting. Should we have a hug and make up?" "Yes, come on. I love you.
We've got each other, and that's all that matters. Ian put his arms around his wife and held her close. Yes, you're right.
Chapter 17. DC Beth Mays looked up from her computer screen as Matt returned to his desk.
You've been gone ages, she said. The boss was looking for you earlier.
I've seen him. I've been to Ivy Cottage, in Wood Lane in Coleshaw Woods, Matt replied. Beth nodded. I took a call earlier from a Miss Jan Hamlin, the young lady who's renting it. She reported intruders in her garden and seeing someone in the woods.
Young lady, Beth said with a sardonic smile. So that's why you were gone so long, rescuing damsels in distress.
Beth knew Matt well enough to be confident that their repartee wouldn't cause offence.
Find anything? She asked.
Not really. There's definitely something getting into her garden, but I don't think it's kids like she does. There were no shoe or trainer prints. She said she'd seen someone outside the cottage and running between the trees in the lane, so I had a look there. And also went into the woods at the back. There was no sign of anyone living there. I wondered if it was Bill Smith wandering again. His dementia is advanced now, and he's got lost a few times. But she was adamant the figure she saw was smaller.
She's blocked up the hole in the back hedge, so hopefully that'll put an end to it.
Why's she living there alone?
Beth asked. That cottage is very remote.
She said she needed to get away, to do some thinking.
Okay, I can identify with that.
She was asking about Coleshaw Woods. She'd been reading articles online and found some about a body in the quarry and a baby that had been heard crying. I reassured her that both cases had been closed. Yes, I investigated the baby crying. Susan Pritchard was the woman who reported it.
She was very upset.
Convinced a baby had been left in the woods.
We took in sniffer dogs, and at one point they picked up a scent, but then it disappeared up a tree. So we guessed it was squirrels. By coincidence, I bumped into Miss Pritchard a few weeks ago in Merryless. She still walks her dog in the woods and believes it was a baby she heard, although she was kind enough to appreciate that we did all we could.
Matt nodded. I told Jan Hamlin if she had any more problems to call and I'd be straight over. Beth was about to reply when DS Bert Scribner appeared at her side.
I need you two to go to Coleshaw Hospital. A body has disappeared from the maternity unit.
You mean a baby, sir? Beth asked.
No, a body. Apparently the baby was born dead yesterday, poor little mite. But now its body has gone missing. The parents are understandably upset. The hospital will hold an inquiry, but the parents want the police involved. They're with the Chief Executive, Anthony Bridges, now, and are refusing to leave until they've spoken to the police.
Very good, sir. We're on our way, Matt said, standing.
Then take yourselves home after, DS Scrivener said. It's nearly knocking off time and you don't need to come back here.
20 minutes later, Beth and Matt arrived at Coleshaw Hospital and went to the main reception desk.
Detectives Constable Beth Mays and Matt Davis, Beth said as they showed their IDs. I understand that the CEO, Mr. Anthony Bridges, is expecting us.
I'll call his office and tell him you're here, the receptionist said, and picked up her phone. As they waited, Beth glanced along the corridor where a security guard was talking to an elderly couple who appeared to be asking for directions. The hospital was busy even at 5 o'clock. Mr. Bridges said, please go up to his office, the receptionist said. Take the lift to the 3rd floor and his personal assistant will meet you there. Thank you. Matt and Beth went to the lift sited to the left of the main entrance and pressed the button for the 3rd floor. A few moments later, The lift doors opened and a young man greeted them. "Hello, I'm Donald, Mr. Bridges' personal assistant. Thank you for coming so quickly. It was getting a bit heated in there. One of our security guards is with them now." Beth and Matt followed the PA down the corridor, where he knocked on a door bearing the nameplate Mr. Anthony Bridges, Chief Executive Officer. The door was opened from inside by a security guard. "The police are here," the PA said, leading the way in. The CEO was seated behind a large desk, talking to a young couple facing him. "You can wait outside now, thank you," Mr. Bridges said, dismissing the security guard. The PA left with the guard. Only once the door was closed did Mr. Bridges speak. "This is Mr. and Mrs. Ryan, Grant and Chelsea," he said. "Detective Constable Beth Mays and Matt Davis," Beth said to them. It was obvious how upset they were. Grant was clearly struggling to contain his anger and itching to have a go at someone. Chelsea's eyes and cheeks were red from crying. Beth drew over a chair so she was sitting at right angles to the couple. Matt remained standing in case quick intervention was required and Grant needed restraining. "I'm sorry for your loss," Beth said as she sat down. Chelsea sniffed, while Grant's face grew harder. "Fucking awful. The way we've been treated. Bad enough our kid dies. But then you get rid of her body, so we can't even say goodbye. We came back today to be told she's gone for good." "That wasn't how I phrased it," Anthony Bridges said in an even, slightly patronizing tone. "It's regrettable this has happened, and we will of course hold an inquiry, although it will take time to gather together all the information," which antagonized Grant even further. His face bulged with anger. "I want him arrested!" Grant shouted, jabbing a finger towards the CEO. Matt took a step towards him. "Then I'll sue the lot of you." "I understand how upsetting this must be for you both," Beth said gently, "and we're here to investigate. Could we start by going back to what happened yesterday?" She took out her notepad and pen. "You tell them. I might hit someone," Grant said to his wife and cracked his knuckles. Chelsea sniffed and took a deep breath. "I had a baby yesterday," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "We knew it was going to be stillborn, and it was very early and badly deformed." "I'm so sorry," Beth said, looking up from writing. "My heart goes out to you both." Grant seemed slightly less riled now he knew his concerns were being taken seriously. "Thank you," Chelsea said. "I was prepared for it, as much as you can be. Our midwife was fantastic. She asked us if we want to see our baby, but advised us against it. She felt it would be too upsetting." "But we want to see our baby today," Grant added. "I understand," Beth said, and looked at Chelsea to continue. "When Grant and I went home last night, we talked about our loss. I also spoke to my sister. She thought we should see the baby as it might help us to come to terms with what had happened." Beth nodded sympathetically. "But when we came here today, we were told her body had already been disposed of," Chelsea said. "Disposed of? Like rubbish?" She pressed a tissue to her face. "It was an unfortunate word to use," the CEO admitted. "Yes, but this is what you've done with our daughter," Grant blurted. "Is that normal procedure?" Beth asked the CEO. "Sometimes, although there seems to have been a breakdown in communication here. Even if the parents don't want to see a stillborn baby, which many don't, we usually keep the body in the mortuary for a few days, in case they change their minds. Sadly, that doesn't appear to have happened in this case. There will be a full inquiry. I've already spoken to the midwife concerned. She's very upset and has offered to meet with the parents if that will help.
It's not Anne's fault, Chelsea said. She was lovely to us.
Was Anne your midwife? Beth asked. Chelsea nodded. Anne Long? Yes, she is one of our most experienced midwives, Mr. Bridges replied. She acted on the parents' wishes, convinced that as the baby was not viable, they wouldn't want to see it. Incorrectly, as it turns out. She is very sorry. We all are. What happened to the body? Beth asked. It would have been incinerated, the CEO replied. Chelsea gave a little cry and wiped her eyes. I am sorry for your loss, Beth said again. She paused, and lowering her voice said compassionately, as it's impossible for you to see your baby, what would you like to happen now? What could the hospital do to help you? Give us compensation, Grant said without hesitation.
Make sure it never happens again to anyone else, Chelsea said.
That seems reasonable, Beth said, looking at the CEO. Of course. Once our inquiry is complete, we'll amend our procedure in line with any recommendations that are made to make sure this doesn't happen again. We always learn from our mistakes. In respect of compensation, if we are found to be to blame, our lawyers will be in touch with Mr. and Mrs. Ryan.
Does that help?
Beth asked the couple. Chelsea nodded, while Grant said, You are to blame, and I don't want this inquiry of yours taking forever. I'm too upset to work. So I need compensation soon.
Will you write a report too? Chelsea asked Beth. I don't want this all being swept under the carpet and forgotten about.
I'll be filing my report first thing tomorrow, Beth said. Do you have any more questions for Mr. Bridges? She asked them both.
No,
Chelsea said. Not right now, but I might in the future, Grant said. In that case, I suggest we leave Mr. Bridges to get on with his work, Beth said and stood. Anthony Bridges threw her an appreciative look. I'll be in touch as soon as we have any news, he reassured Grant and Chelsea. They too got ready to leave. Outside, Matt and Beth saw the young couple off the hospital premises and continued to their car. It was only then that Beth asked Matt, Did you recognize the name of the midwife? Yes, Matt said. It's the same one who delivered Mr. and Mrs. Jennings' baby. 2 stillbirths in a month. Is that normal?
Sadly, yes. I looked it up while I was investigating Mrs. Slater's complaint. 1 in every 223 births are stillborn. That's 3,400 a year. So 9 a day. And that's just those that have been registered because of the number of weeks gestation. The true figure is likely to be much higher. So in that respect, Anne isn't to blame.